Welcome to the British Gliding Association Flight Radio Telephony Operators Licence course, written by Paul Ruskin and Andrew Watson. Please send any comments that you have or suggestions for the course to paul@ruskin.me.uk. We have 4 objectives for this course. The most important is to teach how practically to use a radio whilst flying a glider, so that as a glider pilot we can fly more effectively, access more airspace and fit in with all the other people flying in the same airspace. The days when we, as glider pilots, could sensibly charge around the country without talking to anyone else have gone. Because the licence you will get is a full FRTOL, that's Flight Radio Telephony Operators Licence, you need to know, should you go on to do it, how to operate the radio if you were flying an aeroplane. But the benefit is that by knowing this, you will understand how such aeroplanes operate and how to fit in with them. So that's the third objective. And the last objective is for you to be able to pass your FRTOL test. We've structured this course around a typical cross-country glider flight, albeit one that crosses quite a few pieces of airspace. As we go, we introduce pieces of background information that you need to know. Often, these are about the way that other parts of the aviation world operate. And we identify rules, things you need to apply to what you say. Along the way, there are times to stop and practice, preferably with someone else, and questions to check your understanding. This is our agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the law, then about equipment that the aircraft has. After that, we'll focus on our cross-country flight. There'll be a section on emergencies, a discussion about what to expect in the test, and then in the slide pack there are some references and some acknowledgements. Before you start this set of slides, in the annex you'll find a series of basic tools. These are things you just need to know. If you learn these before attempting the course, it will be very helpful. CAP 413 is the primary reference for RT phraseology, and you'll find a guide to which parts of this are relevant at the end of this presentation. First then, let's talk about the law. An aircraft radio licence is required to install a radio in a glider. The radio needs to be approved. The licence is not expensive, and it also covers the use of a handheld radio used as a backup when it's in the glider. The licence should be carried in EASA gliders, but in the UK it can be held at the airfield. A FRTOL is needed to communicate with any air traffic control unit, flight information service, or air ground communications unit. That means that it isn't needed to communicate with other aircraft on a gliding specific channel or to operate a ground station at a gliding club, nor is it needed on the emergency channel. Let's look at some of the radio equipment that we might find in a glider. Here are a couple of typical glider VHF radios. Whichever radio you have, you need to know how to use it properly, so read the manual and be sure you know how to use it before you get airborne. Many radios have the ability to store multiple radio frequencies, and often to attach a label to these frequencies. This can be very helpful, but make sure that they are kept up to date. Some radios have a dual watch facility which allows you to monitor 2 frequencies at the same time, which can also be very useful. Here's a little bit of theory. VHF stands for very high frequency, and it's the band in which aeronautical transmissions are made. Until recently, this band was occupied by 760 channels of 25 kHz. In Europe, that has now been changed to almost 3 times as many 8.33 kHz channels. Each radio has a squelch control, which suppresses the background noise when there is no transmission. That needs to be set right to avoid noise, but it may be necessary to turn off the squelch to hear weak signals. Radios have an automatic gain control to equalise the volume for distant stations. Since 2019, most VHF aviation frequencies have changed to 8.33 kHz channels. The original 25 kHz frequencies have been split into three 8.33 kHz channels, and strictly we should now talk about channels rather than frequencies. But for RT purposes we're retaining the word frequency, even though the channel number isn't exactly the frequency that the radio is transmitting. It's worth noting that there are a few 25 kHz frequencies left. The emergency frequency 121.5 is one, as are many military airfield frequencies. Also, that as can be seen from the diagram, the 25 kHz frequency, for example 119.0, is exactly the same frequency as the channel 119.005. VHF radio is, more or less, a line-of-sight system. The range to a ground station is determined by the height of the aircraft. The formula can be seen on the page. The actual range is a little more than this, but it's a good guide. It does mean that if you don't get a reply from the recipient, then you might do better trying again when you're higher. Also that, if there's a mountain in the way, you're unlikely to be heard. Here are some useful tips on using a radio properly. Know how to operate the radio of the aircraft you fly. Learn that on the ground, not in the air. Check that the correct frequency is set, the volume is up and the squelch is set properly before you get airborne. Think before you speak and listen before talking. Make sure someone else isn't transmitting and don't try and make up what you're going to say as you do it. Press the PTT, pause, then talk. This avoids clipping your first word. Speak reasonably loudly directly into the microphone. The microphones are directional, and a reasonably loud speaking voice will overcome the wind noise in the glider. Use a normal pace and tone. Don't clip your words. Listen out for your call sign. If you don't hear a transmission properly, use say again. And if you don't understand, say so. The use of plain English is okay. The gliding world now has 8 frequencies, largely for its own use. They are listed here. The FL in the end column is a level above which they lose their protection against reuse. Try and use the frequencies for the purposes described, and avoid cluttering them with inane chatter. Don't forget, you're sharing them with the rest of the gliding world. In particular, the cross-country situational awareness frequencies are best used for very brief progress and condition reports that can be useful to other pilots, rather than a thermal by thermal description of your progress. Using the radio in a glider. Remember, aviate, navigate, communicate in that order. Setting up the radio and making initial calls is best done when high and in the cruise, not when you're low and searching for lift. So have the next frequency in the radio standby box, and before you need it, establish contact with the next airfield. In the event of a communications failure, that is, if your radio fails, VFR aircraft in general are expected to continue to fly VFR, to land at the nearest suitable aerodrome, and to report their arrival by the most expeditious means to the appropriate ATC unit. But that's for aircraft who are being tracked by air traffic units. We're not, in general, as glider pilots in that situation, so in practice it means for us we stay out of controlled airspace, we avoid aerodromes with ATZs that would require communication, and we avoid other places where it would be advisable to use a radio. During 2019, airfield frequencies have been subject to a lot of change. That's largely settled down, but it's still really important to have up-to-date frequencies on board in an easily accessible form. If you have the equipment, the easiest way of doing this is to have them in your nav kit, especially if you can automatically feed those to your radio. But there are plenty of ways involving a few sheets of paper. Some of the larger books, such as Pooley's flight guides, are unlikely to fit in a glider cockpit. It's also worth noting that checking the NOTAMs before your flight is a way of finding out that things have changed that have made it to your pieces of paper. NATs provide frequency reference cards for various parts of the UK, which can be downloaded, printed and laminated. They contain much useful information. However, you do need to pay attention to NOTAMs where changes might be listed that haven't got to the flight reference card. If you have a transponder, knowing where listening squawks could be used is useful. A listening squawk is a code that you transmit on your transponder whilst you're tuned into the appropriate airfield frequency. You don't then have to make a transmission on the radio, but ATC can call you if they want to. And here's the answer for those that would like to know which is the first frequency to call if inbound to a gliding site. This data is also in the BGA turning point file, and you might be able to see that if you have the right nav kit. It also lists the 8 common gliding frequencies and SafetyCom. Most of this data is available electronically for use in suitable equipment, and this slide lists where you can get it from. But the key thing is, if you keep a list of frequencies, you need to make sure the data is up to date.